We're scheduled to look at John chapter 4 this week in our series of studying through the Bibles. If you have a Bible, I invite you to pick it up and to turn over there with me to John chapter 4. The lesson that we're going to be looking at this morning is entitled Evangelism Jesus Way. And probably most, if not all of us, know that the question of what's the best and the most effective way to teach the lost, to reach out to somebody with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's a question that's debated a lot today within the church, and it's probably been debated for years and years and years. I think the answer to that question is based upon several different things. I think, number one, it's based upon an individual's personality. What are their tendencies, the way that they operate. I think it's based upon culture and tradition. What's the most effective way? Well, it might depend from society to society. There's a lot of different areas and avenues to explore whenever you're thinking about a question like that. I don't have the answer to what's the best and the most effective way, but I do have a couple things that I want for us to think about this morning. The first thing is this: if it's a scriptural way, it's a good way. There's not a bad way to present the gospel to the lost, to try to teach somebody the way of salvation if it's in accordance with the scripture. And the second thing that I want for us to think about is some way is better than no way. Sometimes I think we get so overwhelmed or wrapped up in the idea of what's the best and the most effective thing that we just don't do anything. And we're scared we'll do something wrong or we'll say something wrong. And we just don't operate like God wants us to. Now, obviously, when you look at the idea of teaching the lost, there's a lot of different programs that are in operation today the person can use. There's a lot of different materials that are presented to us, a lot of different ways. But what I want us to focus upon today is the way that Jesus did it. And if you're familiar with John chapter 4, you know that this is a scenario, a situation that takes place between Jesus and a woman of Samaria. And when I was putting together these lessons, sometimes I mentioned you get a whole chapter and you think, well, what do I preach from it? Usually, if we study John chapter 4, it's a sermon on true worship, isn't it? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a good lesson. But there's also a lot of other things that we can find within this chapter, I think, that can help us. And so when I'm talking about this morning, Jesus' way, I'm not talking about a technicalities. I'm not talking about a specific formula or a specific material that Jesus presented everywhere that he went and everybody that he spoke to. But I'm really just talking about some common sense and some logical ways to approach somebody when you're trying to evangelize to them, when you're trying to teach them the gospel. And so there's four different things that I want us to think about or look at from John chapter 4 here, based upon Jesus' interaction with the Samaritan woman. The first thing that I'll point out is when you look at Jesus and him going around and teaching those who were lost, it always stands out to me the great care and concern that he had for these individuals. And that's pretty evident when you read John chapter 4 here. Now, the first two verses there in John chapter 4 point out to us that the popularity of Jesus is growing. We talked a little bit last Sunday evening about this fact. John was baptizing and all the people were coming to him and listening to him. And all of a sudden, there's kind of a switch where people start going to Jesus. John is pointing them to him. And so Jesus has eclipsed John in his teaching and in his baptism. What the Bible tells us there is the Pharisees take notice of this. And when Jesus knows that the Pharisees know what's going on, then the Bible tells us that he decides he's going to leave the area of Judea, and he's going to go back into Galilee. Now I want you to notice verse 4 here. Verse 3 says he left the area of Judea, and he departed again into Galilee. And then in verse 4 it says this, very simple statement, but it says, and he must needs go through Samaria. Now that's the King James Version. Now depending on what version you read, there might be a little bit of different translation. I think the New King James Version says he needed to go through Samaria. I was reading another version. I mentioned before, I look at about 15 or 20 different versions whenever I study. That's just my personal way of operation. But one of them said because of the way that he was traveling, he had to go through Samaria. And so that's a pretty interesting statement to me. He needed to go through Samaria, or he had to go through Samaria, because there's a couple ways in which that's not really true. Okay, the first one is, geographically, if he was traveling from Judea to Galilee, he didn't have to go through Samaria. In fact, if you look at the way, now that's probably the most direct route when you look at a travel route, but it wasn't the most popular one, especially for a Jew in that day and age. If you look at the travel route that leads from Judea into Galilee, the main travel route is a very mountainous area. And anybody knows if you're traveling in mountains, you're talking about a hard journey, a rugged journey, a lot of ups and a lot of downs. And so a lot of people just didn't travel that way because of the difficulty, the physical difficulty that it involved. And so geographically, what a lot of people would do is they would kind of cut down east to the Jordan River, and they would either travel in the flatlands of the Jordan Valley on the east or the west side, and then they would go around and come up into the area of Galilee, kind of bypassing all those mountainous travel. So geographically, he could have gone another way. There were other routes that existed in that day and age. The second thing is this too also. Traditionally, for the Jew, that was not the way you traveled to Galilee. Okay, and the reason why is simply this. Now remember the Samaritans, this area in which Jesus is going, and where he has this conversation with this woman at the well, that this area traditionally for the Jews has been settled by kind of what we would consider, the Jews would have considered a half-breed. Whenever Nebuchadnezzar comes and he conquers Jerusalem and he conquers Israel, remember that he removes all of the kind of the higher officials in this area, and what he does is he replaces them with his own people. They weren't Jews by nationality. They didn't have Abrahamic blood flowing through them, but they were placed within these areas, and they lived there, and they settled, and they married, and they interacted. And what happened was there was a result of people with mixed Jewish blood because of these people. That was the Samaritans. And so the Jews, remember them now, the Jews, they were all about the lineage, right? They were all about purity. They were all about Abraham. They did not have anything to do with Samaritans. They didn't want to travel through Samaria. They didn't want to come into contact with a person who was unclean. They didn't want to come into contact with any object. They didn't want to touch anything that was unclean. And so the natural route, travel route, that a Jew would have taken was not through Samaria to get to Galilee. They would have gone down to the Jordan Valley. They would have made a point of going all the way around Samaria and then going up into the land of Galilee. And so you think about that, and then you have this statement here in verse 4, he must needs go through Samaria. So we know it's not true geographically, right? He could have gone another way. We know it's not true traditionally speaking because of the Jews and the way that they traveled. What does that mean then? It simply means this. He had to go there to teach this woman the gospel. He had to go there. It was necessary for him to go there and convert her and to teach her and to teach the village that she was associated with too. And so Jesus knew if he was going to accomplish that, this is the way that he had to go. And why did he go that way? It wasn't because it was a great travel route. It was one of the hardest travel routes in that day and age. It wasn't because it was the way that was most popularly traveled by the Jews. It was because he cared for this woman and her soul and the souls of that village that he goes this particular route. Notice in verse 5 what it says. It says, then he cometh to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground where Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well. And it was about the 6th hour. Think about this journey that Jesus takes in verse 6. It kind of reflects what we've already mentioned here. But as he gets to this particular place and he gets to this well, the Bible says he's worn out. You know, he's wearied from this journey that he's taken. Why has he taken this journey? Why has he chosen this particular path? And what we pointed out was he's chosen it because it's the path necessary to teach this woman the gospel. It's the path necessary to convert this village that she is from. And notice that statement there in verse 6. He was wearied. He was wearied with his journey. Yeah, I thought about that statement. When's the last time you wore yourself out trying to teach somebody the gospel? When's the last time we wearied ourselves by reaching out to those who are lost? Jesus was physically exhausted. He knew he had to be at this point at a certain time, and he wearied himself to get there in order to teach this woman what she needed to do to be saved. I just don't, for us today, we live in such a world and a nation of ease and comfort that we just don't exert ourselves very much. Sometimes, if we're honest, sometimes we're just too lazy to walk across the street and talk to our neighbor. But the reality of the situation is Jesus wore himself out getting to this point in this time to teach somebody the gospel, to make sure that they were saved. And why did he do that? He did that because he cared, didn't he? He did that because he had a concern for this woman's soul and the soul of all that village. We focus so much on our own needs, and especially in the society that we live in, that we feel that we have little, if any, time, to help our family or our friends or our co-workers, or even be worried about them or concerned about their eternal destiny. So the first thing, when I think about Jesus and evangelism, the first thing that really pops out to me is he cared enough to reach out to other people with the gospel. He cared enough to exert himself and to make a good effort to try to make sure that they were saved. The second thing that stands out to me about this particular event is the boundaries that he's willing to cross. There were some I'll call them separating boundaries. There were boundaries that were separating this woman and these people from salvation, from hearing and obeying the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you read about one of them there in verse 5. It says, "Then he cometh to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph." What are the odds? Think about this. What are the odds that this woman would have ever been saved if Jesus hadn't crossed those boundaries? If he hadn't entered into Samaria? As you read about this woman, you think about her, does she stand out in your mind as a person who's going to go to Jerusalem? Is she going to journey down there? Now, she has some religious questions, doesn't she? That's pretty obvious as you read about Jesus' discussion with her. She's looking for the Christ, isn't she? She recognized Jesus asked him, and she goes into this village and she talks about it. But would she have traveled all the way to Jerusalem and looked for the Christ? These were religious questions that were in her mind. If she wanted them answered, would she have made that great journey down to the city of Jerusalem and looked for experts of the law and spoken with them and asked them these questions and then walked away from it? I don't know the answer to that. It's a definite yes or no. But I do know this, the reason that her religious answers or questions got answered, and the reason that she found the Christ, is because Jesus went to her. And a lot of times I think when we think about people obeying the gospel, when we think about salvation today, our concept is this idea, we're here and the doors are open. We want people to come to us, don't we? If somebody's interested in salvation, if somebody has a religious question, the church doors are open. If they'll come in and talk to us, we'll be more than happy, to answer whatever questions they have and to talk to them about salvation. But that's not the way that Jesus operated. He didn't just sit back in Jerusalem and say, if anybody has any questions, here I am. If anybody wants to know about salvation, I'll be sitting right here and they can come to me any time of the day and I'll be glad to have a religious discussion with them. Jesus went out of his way to find these people. And he sought them out, and he answered their questions that they had, and he talked to them about the way of salvation. And it's not wrong, and I don't want you to get this impression that I think it's bad to invite people to church. I don't. I think that's a good thing. But I also think you have to come to that reality and the understanding. A lot of people are never going to come to Jerusalem. Okay? A lot of people are never going to come to physical Jerusalem in the days of Christ. They're not going to come to spiritual Jerusalem today to have their religious questions answered. They're not going to come to spiritual Jerusalem to have a discussion about salvation. But if you go to them, they will talk to you about the concerns that they have. They will ask the questions that they have about religion. And so the only chance that a lot of people have for us today to have their religious questions answered and to learn about the way of salvation is for us to go to them and to speak to them. And that's what Jesus did. Notice in verse 7 here of John chapter 4. It says, there cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest a drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Now I talk about Jesus crossing these boundaries. I read this story, and there's at least 3 boundaries that stand out to me that Jesus crossed. The first boundary that he crossed over was an ethnic boundary, a cultural boundary. You know, again, I mentioned most of the Jews would have never set foot in Samaria. If there was any way that they could avoid it, if there was any way that they could travel around this particular area, they would have done it. Jesus wasn't that type of person. He was willing to step foot in Samaria. He was willing to come into contact with people who a lot of Jews would have considered unclean and never have taken the time of day to have spoken to, much less to have come to them and to sit down with them and to interact with them in the way that Christ did. The second boundary that really pops from this particular event is the gender boundary. And to us, that doesn't seem like a whole lot, you know. Jesus sitting down with a woman here by a well talking to her, that's normal happenstance in our day and age. But understand in the days of Jesus that this was highly scandalous behavior. Okay, it was not appropriate for a man to go out here and to sit down in private with a woman in the middle of nowhere and to have a conversation with her. In fact, very little Jewish males, I'll emphasize that, Jewish males had any kind of public conversation with women. It's just the operation, the mode of their society, their culture. Now, I pointed out before, sometimes you read some things in the Bible and people raise an eyebrow and they say, well, that's not fair. It's just the way that it was. I mean, that's just what you have to understand. Jewish males, it was not uncommon for a Jewish male to utter the prayer, I thank God I am not born a Samaritan or a woman. That was just their way of thinking. And so understand that Jesus here, he was doing something that was out of the normal mode. He was doing something that people would have considered, you know, very questionable in his day and age. The third barrier, of course, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, but it's the traditional religious thinking of that day and age. And you see that in the conversation that Jesus has with this Samaritan woman. Jesus asked her there in verse 9 for a drink. And she says this. Notice her reaction. She didn't say no or yes. She says, why are you, a Jew, asking me to give you something to drink, a Samaritan? Okay, because here's what she understood. And the conversation goes on. She says, you don't have a water pot. You know what that means? Jesus is going to have to drink out of her water pot. You know who's drunk out of that water pot? Well, probably her and a lot of other Samaritans, probably some animals too. You know who's touched that water pot? An unclean woman. How can you ask a question like that of me? You know, she understood that this was very rare in her day and age. But you look at the life of Jesus, and here's Jesus, you know, he's going over boundary to try to teach this woman the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, that doesn't mean, and I don't want to give the implication that Jesus ever participated in something sinful. You know, I hate to have to say that as a preacher, but I always say I have to say it because I feel that responsibility. It doesn't mean that we cross boundaries that are sinful. That's not what Jesus did. He just did things that weren't in the normal of his day and his age. And he did that in order to reach people with the gospel of Christ. So he comes into her world where she's comfortable, and he presents to her the gospel, and he answers her religious questions that he has. We have to take the gospel. That's the point that I'm making. We have to make the effort to cross the boundaries and take the gospel to people. Because there are just some boundaries that people are very uncomfortable crossing today. And if we aren't the ones who's doing the crossing, there's a good chance that they'll never hear the gospel or be evangelized. The third thing that I want to point about Jesus is he made a connection with people. When you read about him, he interacts with them in a very natural, laid-back, ordinary setting kind of way. And that's what's amazing to me in his interaction with this woman that we read about here in John chapter 4. Now notice in verse 7, you'll read just a little bit about that connection that he makes with her. It may not seem like a lot to us today, but it says, there cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water, and Jesus saith unto her, give me to drink. So we read about what Jesus has done up to this point. Up to this point, he's really just established contact. He just had some small conversation. But now he actually establishes some common ground with her. And that common ground is based upon, as simple as it seems, thirst and water. Okay, so she was coming to draw water. Jesus was saying, I need water. You're providing for thirst. I'm a person who is thirsty. And what he emphasizes to her is she had this power and this ability to give something to him. But he uses that in verse 10. He turns it back around. He says, you have this power and this ability to give me something to drink physically, but I have a power and ability to give you something to drink spiritually. And so in verse 10, he talks about, he says, if thou knewest the gift of God and who it is that saith unto thee, give me to drink, thou wouldest ask of him, and he would have given thee living water. Now, it's, again, interesting. I always love to study the interaction of Jesus with people. And we know that he did it perfectly because he knew every man. We don't have that luxury, and we don't have that great opportunity. But it is always interesting to me to think about just how natural these conversations were that Jesus had with these people. You think about it, there's nothing forced about it. It's not like Jesus is out here and there's this awkward transition into spiritual conversation. Just like this normal, ordinary day happening, and Jesus stumbles up here and he starts this conversation, and before you know it, they're talking about living water. And before you know it, they're talking about worshiping God. And before you know it, they're talking about morality and how a person should live. And what we learn about this woman later on in the chapter in verse 16, Jesus tells her, he says, go and call your husband and come hither. And the woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou hast now is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. We find out this was a woman who was living an immoral life. She had a lot of falsely held religious beliefs too, didn't she? You read that about her idea of worship in John chapter 4 there. How do you start a conversation with somebody like that? I think about us as Christians today. How would we have approached this woman? A highly immoral woman, a woman who has a lot of false religious belief. I think a lot of times as Christians we think, well, first thing we need to do is straighten them out, right? First thing we need to do is talk about all the false religious beliefs that they hold, and talk about the immoral life that they're living. But the first thing that Jesus does is he establishes some common ground with this woman. He makes a connection with her in this conversation about water and the well and things like that. And so he gives her an opportunity to help him, and then he in turn can help her. Now, why is that important? Well, again, I think about the Jews of Jesus' day. Think about how hard they tried to avoid interaction with the world. Think about how hard they tried to go out of their way to avoid them, not to talk to them, not to do anything with them. And Jesus didn't act like that at all. Jesus is out here. He's trying to connect with these people. No, he's going where they're going. He's doing the things that they're doing. He's sharing things with them. He's interacting with them. And I think about the statement that John made of the Jews in John 18 and verse 25. Remember when they want Pilate to put Jesus to death? But the Bible says they won't go into the praetorium. They don't want to go to a place where sinners are. They don't want to go to a place where they might touch somebody unclean or they might touch something unclean. And so they're out here separating themselves. Even though they want Jesus to die, they don't want to get too close to a Gentile. They want to avoid them at all costs. They walled themselves off. The Jews of Jesus' day walled themselves off from the rest of the world. And I think as Christians, we got to be careful about that. A lot of times I think we have that thinking and that mentality of the Jews of that day. We want to avoid the worldly people at all costs. We don't want to interact with them. We don't want to have a conversation with them. We don't want to do anything together with them. And if we do interact at all with them, just like the Jews of Jesus' day, it's going to be to rebuke them, right? Or it's going to be to correct some false view that they hold. Jesus treated all people like like people. He valued them. They were people of worth that were to him. And what we have to understand as Christians is there's things that we can do. We can interact with the world and form connections through that. It doesn't have to be spiritual at first. There are physical connections that we can make with the world. Maybe there's a business or a service that they can offer to us. Maybe there's a common hobby that we have with one another. There's a number of areas that we could look at, but the reality of it is Jesus used this connection. He wasn't ashamed to ask this for a drink from this woman, and he used that connection that he made with her to open a spiritual door. And I think that's a great lesson for us. Connect with a person physically, use that connection to open a spiritual door. The fourth thing, the last thing that I'll make mention of, is he communicated the good news to her. Jesus tells her in verse 10, he said, "If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that said to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest ask of him, and he would have given thee living water." So we have this idea, we care for a person's soul, we cross the boundaries that are keeping them from getting their religious questions answered, talking about or learning about the way of salvation, and then we connect with them on a physical level first. Now, all that is pre-evangelism. Let me emphasize to you. All those things are setting up the opportunity to evangelize to these people. And so thus far, you read about Jesus, what he's done. He hasn't evangelized to her yet, has he? He's just setting himself up in a position where he has the opportunity to talk to her about salvation. And so he does that in verse 10. He tells her about the salvation that God offers. And there's a couple of things that I want to point out from this communication that Jesus had with this woman. The first one is, and I kind of emphasized it, made mention of it, he took the situation that they were in and he used that to point to spiritual realities. That's important for us today. I often think about, how, and this is a question I think that a lot of us have. How do I start a conversation about religion? With my neighbor, with my friend, with my family member. You look at Jesus, he used the situation they were in, and from that, he developed a spiritual conversation. And so again, when you look at Christ's conversation with people, they aren't uncomfortable conversations. Do you have any inkling as he's talking to this woman that she's over here in an uncomfortable situation? No, she's enjoying it. She loves interacting with Christ. There's nothing unnatural about their conversation. There's nothing awkward. There's nothing forced about it. Jesus just talks about the situation that they're in, and he finds a way to relate that to a spiritual principle. And friends, let me also emphasize to us today, those of us who are parents, if you want to teach your children about the gospel and salvation, you want to have those spiritual conversations, that's one of the best ways to do it. Just take whatever environment you're in and look for a spiritual application. And you know what? That's very natural. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel awkward in any way. But it's a great lesson that Jesus used, or a principle that he used in talking to this woman. So use whatever environment we're in, whether it's our hobby, our work, our family. Find ways, how does this relate to the gospel? How does this relate to salvation? And then the second point from verse 10 that I want you to think about is this. Jesus said, if you knew. And isn't that the point of evangelism? People don't know. She didn't know what the proper answers were to the questions that she had. She didn't know how to worship God acceptably. She didn't know how to live a moral life. And so the point is this, Jesus is telling her, if you knew these things, then here's what would happen in your life. People have no idea. And that's the approach that we should take whenever we're talking to somebody. They have no idea about how to worship God. They have no idea about how to live a moral life. They have no idea about who the Christ is. If they knew, we wouldn't need to be talking to them, right? But Jesus knew that this woman didn't know. She didn't understand it. And so they don't know these great gifts that God has for them. They don't know this great plan that God has for them. And it's our job to tell them this plan. Do their hearts yearn for it? Yeah. I mean, as human beings, do you think that every human being, their life revolves around, oh boy, another work day? Is that what life is all about? They don't know it, but deep down inside, there's a greater yearning. And it's not about empty hobbies or recreation that we can be engaged in. The heart of the gospel is God has a great gift that he wants to give to you. And that's what Jesus talked to people about. The greatest gift imaginable. God holds it in his hand, and he wants to give you that gift. But we have to tell people, don't we? They don't know about it. We have to be the ones to tell them. You know, you go down to the end of this story, and again, we didn't look at all of it, but I want to look at verse 28 here. It says, the woman then left her water pot and went her way into the city and said unto the men, come see a man which told me all things that I ever did. Is not this the Christ? Then they went out of the city and came unto him. Do you know what this woman's initial reaction is? She immediately wants to go tell other people, doesn't she? And she does. Now, I want you to think about this. How much did this woman know? How much about morality did she know? How much about worship did she know? All she knew is she found the Christ. And she wanted to go tell other people about that. As Christians today, we're so worried about, I don't know enough. You know, I don't know enough to talk to somebody about Jesus. This woman puts us to shame, doesn't she? I mean, what little knowledge she had, but she had great zeal. She had a willingness to speak. And if you read the rest of the story, a lot of the other Samaritans come out of the village. And they listen to Jesus, and they're converted because of that. You think about this woman. She's probably one of the most unlikely prospects for salvation in the Bible. But God used her, Christ saved her, and he also used her to bring out others to salvation for them. So I want us to think about that. Think about that in the upcoming days. You know, we're getting the time around holidays. We're going to have a lot more interaction with people. But think about evangelizing. Think about teaching those who are lost. Do we really care enough to teach them, to go out of our way, to make an honest effort to try to bring somebody the gospel of Christ? Are we willing to cross boundaries that they won't cross to get here to the church building? Are we willing to do that to bring to them the gospel of Christ? We need to connect with them on a physical level first. Don't just walk in and start browbeating people. That's one of the worst ways to try to teach somebody the gospel. Don't start pointing out, well, you don't do this in your life morally, religiously, you're not doing this, worshiping this is wrong. Establish a connection with them first. And after you've connected with them, then use that. And last but not least, tell them the gospel. You got to communicate the gospel. You know, all those other things are pre-evangelism stuff, but you actually have to teach them the gospel of Christ. Now, I know that